Okay, we'll make a start. Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to the latest Horizons Institute Insight series. Today's Insight series is looking at the FailSpace, recognizing, acknowledging, and learning from failure. Let's see. Okay, so now I'm Dave Riley. I am research manager. I'm a research manager at the Horizon Institute. Now, I know a lot of you will know who we are already, but I know that we have a lot of people, we have new people on the call who may not have heard of us or know what we do. So the Horizons Institute, we're an interdisciplinary research institute based at the University of Leeds. And as this, I won't read out the blurb here, but we look to basically foster early stage challenge-led research ideas. And we look to develop novel collaborations and enhance interdisciplinary skills and basically build up the status of interdisciplinary research at Leeds and around the world. And we do that through 4 pillars. Our headline pillar is the strategic development goals, sustainability development goals. We have challenge networks, which some of you, if you're at Leeds, may have heard of recently, whereby we get together interdisciplinary groups and we fund them and we support them to build their networks. We have a global academy, which is a global program which involves academics from the University of Leeds and universities from the global south to come together to basically work on interdisciplinary ideas together. And we have our 4th pillar is partnerships for societal impact, whereby we work with organizations like Leeds 2023 and Bradford 25 in the future. And we do that through, we also put on a number of events. So obviously collaborative labs are something that we do a lot, where we bring people together to develop their ideas. We put on events to explore new partnerships. We have lots of group sessions. We like to get people talking to each other about new, innovative, interdisciplinary ideas. So that's us. Today's presenters, we have Professor Leila Jancovich, who is Director of Research and Innovation at the School of Performance and Cultural Industries. She's also the Principal Investigator for the AHRC FailSpace project. And we have Kate Wafer, who is the Director of Wafer Hadley, which is a cultural insight consultancy. For the meeting today, we just ask you to keep your microphones off, and we will invite you to ask questions at various points, and we would like you to pop them in the chat with the prefix of with a Q on it, so we know it's a question. If there's time, at various points, we'll open the floor to digital hand raises too. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Kate and Leila, who should be able to share your screens.
Thank you, Dave. And thank you, everyone. Welcome. So I'm Leila Jancovich, and Kate, do you just want to say hello yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Wafer.
As Dave said, I'm the Principal Investigator for the FailSpace project, which is what we're going to be talking about today. But Kate has been working with us to champion and embed some of the findings from the research in practice. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to the research itself, and then Kate's going to talk probably at more length about actually putting some of the research findings into practice. So I'm going to just share my screen initially, and we seem to be. Can you see my screen? I'm seeing Kate's screen. You're not seeing anything, are you? Yeah. Screen sharing has stopped.
I could see your screen.
Can you?
I could, yeah.
We could briefly.
Let me just try again. What happened there? Okay, it's maybe because I had yours and mine open now. Where's my apologies, everybody. Let me just open it again. I'm about to get my emails. Why isn't it want to? Right, hang on one second. I'm having a technical problem on my end.
Anyway, if it gets to, I can share it from my end as well, Leila.
Can you, if you've got it
that's
there, that
more
might
helpful.
save some time, because I don't know why it suddenly doesn't like it.
That's
It was
okay.
fine when we tried it a minute ago.
That's okay. Is it that's the one, is it? Can you see that?
Yeah, that's it. So, Dave, unfortunately, you'll have to move through the slides for me. So Dave's already introduced who we are, and I've said who we are, so we can move straight on from that first slide. Just to set a bit of context for who we are, or our background. So I'm, as Dave said, I'm Professor of Cultural Policy and Participation here at the University of Leeds. But before becoming an academic, I worked for many years in the cultural sector, as Kate still is doing. We've both worked on research and evaluation for cultural organisations, as well as kind of within a policy context. We've both done consultancy with industry partners, and we're both collaborating, as I said before, on the FailSpace project at the moment. So today's really is going to, as I've said this already, it's going to be introducing what FailSpace is about, but more specifically kind of talking about what the findings mean in practice. There is a whole training package that goes with FailSpace. There's toolkits. There are workshops. So if people are interested in further work, we have talked with Horizons about potentially doing a workshop as well as this session. But this session is really kind of to talk about the principles about talking about failure, and to kind of test people's thoughts about talking about failure in general. So I guess in terms of Dave saying if there's time for questions, I really hope there is time for questions, because we'd like to run this a bit as a discussion for people's views on the research and on the approach we're taking. So Dave, if you want to go on to the next slide, where I'll introduce what FailSpace is, where it came from. So as Dave said, it's a AHRC-funded programme, but where it came from was partly from my background working in the cultural sector for years, working on I've worked at the Arts Council, I've worked with arts organisations, I've done a lot of work around participatory activity, I've written evaluation reports. And what I kind of got increasingly frustrated with was that kind of sense that all the narratives were about all these fantastic projects, all these fantastic initiatives, all these fantastic policy interventions, and yet actually there was nothing much was changing. So not saying that those weren't fantastic projects and initiatives, but actually there was very little acknowledgement of what wasn't working, what was failing, and why there were barriers to change in terms of the sector. So our research came from asking that question: what would happen if we stopped talking about impact and saying just measuring the, because when we talk about impact, we never talk about the negative impacts we might have on people. We only talk about the positive impacts. What would happen if we stopped talking about impact and evaluation as something to make the case and justify what we've done and celebrate the successes of what we've done, and we're much more honest about what the failures and what we might learn from those failures? So over a 2-year period, we did a range of different interventions in the cultural sector. We ran workshops with people to try and help them co-define what success and failure meant for them. So it wasn't just us determining what success and failure was. We did interviews with people across the cultural sector and with a number of case studies to ask them what the levers and barriers were to talking about failure, why they didn't do it, what the benefits might be of doing so. And we also had kind of confessionals in the form of honesty boxes and online anonymous surveys, where we actively asked people to tell us stories of failure that they'd never told anyone before. And we did that very deliberately with policymakers, producers, deliverers of cultural work, and with participants or beneficiaries of that work, to try and get a sense of what success and failure meant for those different constituents. And that's kind of really important to our approach in understanding that success and failure means different things for different people. And what we were doing there really, as I say, is exploring the attitudes to failure, whether people thought there was value in what we were asking people to do. And there was a clear sense there at the beginning that some people said, our research was irresponsible and we shouldn't be doing it, and asking them to talk about failure is something that, yeah, we just shouldn't be doing. But also what would happen if we captured alternative narratives and alternative voices that we don't often hear in those kind of stories of success that are so prevalent. And what we found very strongly in our research was a real barrier to honesty and critical reflection in the cultural sector. But since we finished that first phase of research and have gone into the dissemination phase, that barrier really replicated in other sectors as well. So not being specific to the cultural sector by any means. And that those barriers were very much around a lack of trust, particularly in our constituents, between policymakers, deliverers and practitioners. And so nobody really trusting anybody else. So policymakers classically saying that they were okay talking about failure. It was the organisations who weren't willing to be honest with them. Organisations saying they were okay talking about failure. It's that the policymakers didn't want to hear it. And both of them tending to blame the participants that, well, we can't because it might upset the participants, without anyone actually asking the participants how they felt. And what we found interestingly was that the participants were the ones most comfortable talking about failure and who had least of a barrier to it. But what that kind of lack of trust we found was that it really leads to a kind of blame avoidance, where everybody sees the failure as somebody else's responsibility. And so a real personalization of blame, looking for somebody to put the blame onto, rather than kind of seeing a shared responsibility to reflect and learn from what's gone wrong. And also a fundamental sense that evaluation is not about learning in most cases. Evaluation is about accountability and monitoring. And that very little will actually, in many sectors, to actually use evaluation to improve the offer for the future, and much more focus on how you just use it to get more funding for the future. And that's replicated by the example I put there of one of our anonymous postcards, of someone who just fully accepts that, you know, the purpose of evaluation is to lie to get money, and they saw it as nothing other than that. Next slide, please, David. So what we're trying to do from the research is kind of, and to add to that, because Dave's showing slides, I'd added a point at the bottom, but what we also found through doing the research was that while people might have been very against us doing the research at the beginning, once we'd actually got people sharing stories of failure, people talked about it feeling really cathartic, really liberating, really empowering. And so there became quite quickly quite a strong appetite for our research, for the findings from the sector itself. So what we're moving forward, what kind of our aim has been to really shift that approach to impact and evaluation from accountability to thinking of it as a learning tool, which is based on improvement, as I just said on the last slide. So we're trying to shift the approach. So instead of the kind of classic input-output models that you see, what would happen if we actually used a more reflective approach? So we've been working with funders and other people to try and get them to change the language of applications and evaluation forms. So instead of what are you going to do, now let's measure whether you did it, more, you know, what would success and failure feel like and look like, and, you know, how will you know, and what whether you've reached that, you know, what's your learning along the way. And so fundamentally, to do that, we're arguing you need to do that from the beginning. At the beginning, think about what you're trying to, what success and failure will look like, what you're trying to achieve, not just what you'll do, so that at the end you can really reflect on where you've got to in that stage. Next slide, Dave. So the framework we've developed, which, as I say, is part of a whole package of kind of tools and resources that we've made available online, if anyone's interested, kind of tries to address the fear of failure, which we very quickly realised was a fear of seeing success and failure as very binary opposites. You either succeed or you fail. And we're trying to get people to recognise that success and failure exist along a spectrum. Very few people succeed completely or fail completely. Most work is somewhere in the middle. And if you look at the toolkit, the kind of those different criteria, the spectrum is explained in more detail, but most stuff exists. It's either a tolerable failure, yeah, there is some failure, but it's okay because there are other benefits of it, or a conflict is success. It's successful for some people, but not for other. And actually the interesting conversations we had with people were around that middle ground, or really trying to get them to think about, is it tolerable or is it intolerable, that failure? Similarly and crucially, for talking to people about failure, we realised that people, again, kind of linked to that binary idea, that people were scared about talking about failure if they were seeing it as the entire project activity, their work was a failure. But if you broke it down into the different facets of failure, so we've talked about the difference between the purpose of it, whether you achieved your purpose, or the process of it, practice, you know, who gets to participate, and the level of profile. If you break it down in those 5 areas, people are much more comfortable with the idea they might succeed or fail differently in those different components. So you might, for example, have a fantastic process, but it doesn't actually achieve your purpose. Or you might, and what we found very often with work was, you might, and I would say is the case for our own research, it might have be very successful in terms of its profile, but it might not change the world in the way, it might not achieve the purpose we have of necessarily meaning that things have fundamentally changed. But so crucially, we need to think about success and failure as across a spectrum, across different facets, but also it exists at different points in time. So what might feel like a success on the day might not leave a legacy. Similarly, what might feel like a failure at the time might have a real legacy if you actually learn from it and make changes as a result of it. And also, crucially, as I said already, it may feel differently to different people. So what's a success for me might not be a success for Kate for this afternoon. What's a success for us might not feel like a success for all of you or any of you individually within the room. So really trying to capture different voices being a really crucial part of the process that we're talking about. Dave, next one. So just kind of to finish before I pass on to Kate. So as I said, that's kind of the main thing that came out of our research. But as I just said there, what we found was that although our research clearly had impact in terms of profile, clearly had got a lot of people interested, including our funders, who asked us to go in and do workshops with their own staff about how they could more recognise failure better. Our question was, how do we actually embed it? How do we follow through? And how do we test that our theory works in practice? So we've been partnering with policymakers and practitioners from the cultural sector, and Kate is one of those who's with us today, to think about how they embed it within their own organisations, or in Kate's case, with the companies she's consulting with. And she's going to talk briefly, or maybe not briefly, about the experience that she's had doing that. But just before that, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of the failures potentially of our own research before I pass over, and the questions that's left us with. And the first one is about the danger of being a victim of your own success, the profile of the research, the popularity of the tools that we've developed means that we're really finding that people email me constantly to say, oh, I love your tools, your toolkit, we're using it all the time. And then you ask the next question, but what's changed? What have you learned or changed as a result of that? And they're like, oh no, I just like your tools. It's kind of more like they're using a board game rather than actually necessarily changing practice as a result of it. There's also, and I think Kate will talk about this, the danger with some of the funders we've been working with, that whereas what we're proposing is a replacement for the evaluation model that they've been using before, that what we're finding often is it's an additional burden that's being placed on people, that they want you to do all the old stuff and do this new stuff. And that's problematic for us, obviously. But also, despite all the enthusiasm for the tools, I think we're really experiencing a resistance to change. And Kate might challenge me on that and say that I want to move too quickly, but I'll leave it at that, pass over to her to kind of to talk about her own experience on working with us on this.
Great. Thanks very much, Leila and Dave. It's great to have that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Can everybody see that okay? Great. Yeah, I'm a consultant. I'm based in Leeds, but I work all over the UK. I work predominantly in the cultural sector, but I also work in not-for-profit sector. I'm actually working with the University of Leeds with a participatory research fund, looking at using FailSpace or experimenting with FailSpace with those organisations or those individuals who are doing that research at the moment. So that's quite an interesting part of it. But I'm going to focus in this presentation just on the work I've done with AHRC-funded. So AHRC-funded is an independent funding body based in London, but works all over the UK, a grant-giving organisation. And I've been working with them since 2019. And I think I first came across FailSpace through the Cultural Institute, but I can't actually remember where I found it, but I immediately kind of thought, oh, this is interesting, because at that time I was developing an evaluation strategy for AHRC-funded, really trying to interrogate what evaluation they were asking organisations to provide, how it was being used, whether it was actually informing their policy and planning. And when I saw FailSpace, I thought, hang on, this actually might crack what we're trying to resolve here. So we were trying to develop greater honesty in the relationships with the organisations, exactly as Leila said, not having endless narrative reports that kind of trumpet all the successes, but don't talk about the learning, don't talk about the difficulties, which is obviously not, I think, not good for the organisation, but not good for the funding organisation, because if you don't know what doesn't go wrong, you don't know what to fund or not fund next time. So we really wanted to have that honesty, inform the policy and planning that they were doing, also trying to minimise the burden on organisations. We were hearing so much that, you know, most organisations, even a relatively small project might be funded by multiple funders. So then having to do different evaluations for different funders was really difficult. So we wanted to try and minimise that. And we really wanted to focus on learning and not assessment, actually learning for AHRC-funded, but learning for the organisations, and not be about monitoring and checking up on organisations that they had done things. So that was my starting point for thinking about using FailSpace. So we've used FailSpace with about 3 different cohorts for one funding programme. We're trialling out one funding programme that's particularly about asking organisations to experiment, and it seemed a good place to try that. So we're still learning, but hopefully I can share a little bit more about where we've got to with that this afternoon. So let's just take a pause and think about, what do we mean by failure? Because we're saying fail-space failure and just it trips off the tongue when you start talking about it. But I think it's really important just to first say, when you bring failure into a room with a group of people, I've done this enough times now, I think, to know you get one of 2 reactions. You get fear or you get relief. And I don't know whether, just check in with yourself now, what does that word do for you? What's the emotion that comes up for you? You'll see I've got a quote here. This is from one of the organisations we've worked with. This was their first reaction. It took time to emotionally get over the word failure. And this, by contrast, I shifted out of the rose-tinted voice. It was a relief. We're being held back by not being open. So that's the first place you get to with people. And it's really worth saying that because we don't talk about a failure, it's quite a personal experience for people. It's also an embodied experience. Quite a lot of people have a physical reaction to the word failure. And you could be put off at that stage. You could have a group of people who immediately all react quite negatively, and fear comes into the room and you think, oh, we won't do this. Let's not talk about failure. It's too difficult. And actually, what we found is that you need to push through that, because what the benefit of FailSpace is that you, as Leila was saying, this idea that failure is not binary is actually revelatory to a lot of people. It changes the conversation straight away. the fear can go and you get more relief, I guess, from it too. But actually just to push through and to kind of work through those immediate reactions that people have to the word failure or the idea of failure is really important if you're going to get anywhere with you using FailSpace, I think. So our process has been to take a cohort of organisations who've all had funding. We've done an introductory workshop to FailSpace, and Leila has done some of those with us in the past. And we asked them then to go away and do the FailSpace grid. I'm going to show you an example as a team right at the beginning of that process to try and at least plot the two poles. What would outright success and outright failure look like? And I've said team work because what we found is really important is to get people as a group of colleagues to work on this together. That's where it's really, really beneficial. What you sometimes have in organisations is that your development person who's liaising with the funder just does this stuff themselves. They don't actually have conversations with the people who are even delivering the project sometimes. They just do the paperwork and that's how it sits, which I think we really need to challenge that way of working because all the learning just is totally getting lost there. So we get them to do that initial grid. We ask them to come back to it through their project and see how they're getting on, whether they've changed their ideas, where they think they're going to get to. And then at the end, we've asked them to complete that grid, the whole grid. I'm going to show you an example in a second. And then pull out just bullet points of what the learnings have been. So compared to a long narrative report, it's on paper much easier to do. You fill out a one page and some bullet points, and that's what you send in. So here's an example of one. Just you can see they've completed it, and then the beige one is kind of identifying where they've landed. When Leila saw this, she pointed out that they've only had, oh no, you said it was all successes, but there is a tolerable failure on here. So there is a tolerable failure. And it's quite useful just to see how someone completes it. But people do complete it in different ways. There's no kind of right or wrong way of doing it, I don't think.
And the successes are at least conflicted ones.
Yes, that's true. That's true. So just going back to the facets that Leila showed you. So you've got purpose, participation, process, practice, and profile. I'm still hoping to get those to trip off my tongue in the way that I'd like them to. And what I've put on the other side is on the scale. This really came from one of our participants who said they found it much more easy to think of it as percentages. So actually outright failure. I've actually got my scale the wrong way around. So outright failure should be 0% and outright success should be 100%. So thinking about it numerically like that can be quite useful if you're more of a numbers person. What we found in working through these things is sometimes it could take a whole workshop to just interrogate purpose. And that has been really, really useful because you have a group of people who actually don't know what it is they're trying to achieve, or they have different ideas about what they're trying to achieve. We know that because a lot of the projects that are funded are participatory, they're about participation projects, lots of thought goes into that, but no thought goes into process, practice, and profile. And it's been really incredibly valuable to get people to just think about what kind of process do we want? How do we want to work together as a team? How will we work with our partners? And also things like profile, actually, not just about the marketing of the activity, but what about the profile of the organization? How are we going to maximize this through this project? So some of this thinking I've discovered hasn't even been done because it's not asked for in the application in the first place. But actually it's really valuable to do this at the beginning of a project to get organizations to really consider. So that's been very helpful at the starting point. So what have we found through this process so far? Well, I've compared these to usual reports, by which I mean a narrative report, maybe 25 to 150 pages, depending on the scale of the project. So compared to a narrative report, which just says, we did this, here's some numbers, here's some charts, wasn't it all brilliant? Some people find the grid much easier to complete, other people find it harder. I think it really does depend on how your brain works. But certainly these narrative reports are described as just box ticking, really, that people feel that's all they're doing. and they don't discuss it as a team. It's just somebody goes away and writes a report, ticks it, and they get the last 10% of their grant done. It's not actually a reflective process at all. What we've got with FailSpace, harder for some people, easier for others, but much more about learning, about reflecting, much more honest conversations. Most people on balance find it more fun and more positive, which is interesting given the immediate reaction you get of maybe fear of talking about failure, that actually the outcome of these conversations is a much more positive one. It encourages really interrogating those outcomes, really thinking about it, and maybe disagreeing, actually, that I think this is where we landed, or I think this is where we landed, and having that language about discussing failure within organizations. Generally, it takes longer to discuss. People think, oh, we'll just put an hour aside and we'll have a look at this reflection on this FailSpace grid, and it takes a lot longer than that to do it properly. But then when you've actually done it, completing the grid and pulling out the learning is much shorter to complete for people. And I've pulled out this phrase, which was the title I used, was Conversations Over Coffee, which came from one of our organizations. They said they loved it because this was what they were actually doing. They were actually sitting down as a group of colleagues and having proper conversations over coffee about what they were doing, what was working, what wasn't, what they would do next time, in a way that they didn't feel that they were doing before. So for me, this is all really incredibly positive. What is FailSpace good for? It is particularly good for experimental elements of projects where you don't know. It's not very good for more practical outputs, to be honest. If you've just got funding to buy some equipment, you don't need to put it on a kind of spectrum of success or failure. You either bought it or you didn't. I suppose it could be whether it worked or not, but let's move on from there. It's very useful for teasing apart different elements of projects, really those 5 facets, to really actually look from different angles at what works and what doesn't. We've certainly found it's good for exploring gut reactions. People often feel like they failed, when they do this exercise, they realize that they haven't. Actually, it was a resilient success or a conflicted success, but it wasn't the outright failure that they'd said in their heads. We didn't do everything we set out to do, so we've totally failed. And I think psychologically, that's a very helpful thing to be working with people on. Uncovering unexpected benefits, that's been something just by having those deeper conversations that we've seen, greater nuance. I've put ADHD on here just because I've had a little bit of feedback from people who say that this process works much better for the way their brain works, but I don't know whether that might be about ADHD or just about that particular individual. One thing it's less good for is if you've got a very complex multi-strand project. It's quite hard to get that into one grid, to be honest. I have had organizations do different parts of projects on different grids, but it does become a bit more complicated if you do that. So that's just something to bear in mind. This is one of the quotes from one of the organizations we had. In other evaluations, we leave out the learning and failures and spin the findings. And I think that really speaks to what Leila was talking about at the moment. At the beginning was, that feeling that you're just talking about successes, you're spinning it so you can get more money, but the learning is not happening. So what have we learned so far? So as well as using FailSpace with organizations, we're trying to use it with Art Fund in their teams when they're doing projects. And I keep having to nudge them. They're getting a little bit better at talking about it. Certainly the language of failure within the organization is much more common. So new people come into the organization, they say, oh, I've heard about this FailSpace thing. What is it about? So it's definitely something that's there within the culture. They're not always using it as kind of readily as I would like them to, but I'm working on that. But what we've learned is it does need a bit of forewarning to start talking about a failure with a group of people. It does need trust and it needs conversation to really make it work. I think we're starting to change the dynamic between the funded organisations and the funder, and that was one of the things we wanted to build on. Actually, that sense of relief that people get when talking about a failure is the idea that they could actually be honest with a funder is quite kind of revelatory, I think, and that the funder wants to know when things don't go wrong, don't go right, and wants to learn themselves from that and build their funding on that learning. That feels like people are like, oh, that's what we want to see happen. That actually we won't be penalised for things going wrong. We might actually, that might even be a benefit to say, okay, you gave us a bit of funding to try something. We tried it. This is what worked. This is what didn't. Now we'd like to take that idea forward. And that could be a really beneficial way of working. One of the things we are seeing, starting to see, it's a bit of a glimmer, because even though we've done a number of cohorts, it does still feel like early days. But once you have a whole set of grids together, you can actually start to look across a programme and say, okay, there's some strands of kind of feedback here that are quite useful. So, for example, on this one project programme that we've been looking at, we can see that what they set out to achieve, their sort of what they set out as outright success in terms of participation is normally they don't achieve it. Their expectations are much too high about the numbers of people who might participate or how much participation they might achieve. So that's quite useful to be able to start to say, when you put them together, we can see trends and patterns emerging. And that's where we would like to get to more of, because that will really help to inform funding and practice and policy in the future. So we're still exploring. I'm still using FailSpace wherever and whenever I can, with different organisations, not just on Art Fund work. We're not quite sure how much yet is just being adopted within the sector. We do know that some people are just, the language of failure is something that's come into their organisation, but they're not using the tools specifically. We don't know quite what the barriers are yet. We want to know more about that, and we're going to be doing a piece of evaluation of the evaluation we've done for this programme at Art Fund, which will tell us a bit more about that. Does it give us enough information to inform policy and planning? My feeling is that it will do over time, but I have got colleagues at Art Fund who still holding on to that narrative report. They still feel that they would like more of that narrative to explain it. And also, we're still exploring where is it most appropriately used, what kind of programmes, what kind of activity, what kind of organisations does it work with well? And the more we do it, the more we find out about that. So I'm going to leave it there, because I'm hoping we have got a little bit of time left still for some questions and conversation. So I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate and Leila. That's fascinating. Really, really interesting. I've got questions, but I'm going to give everybody else the chance to come in first. So if you can either type your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand. I'm still quite new to Teams. I'm sure you can raise your hand. I'm not exactly sure how. Or failing that, just unmute yourself and speak up. I know that's a brave thing to do. We've got a hand. Okay, we've got a hand there from Matthew.
So thanks, David. Thanks, Leila. Thank you, Kay. I just got a very kind of simple question, actually, around political context. And Leila, am I right in thinking a lot of this idea was developed over the coalition and the Conservative government of the last 14 years? But I guess it comes from New Labour policy as well, potentially, talking about some of your history in that work.
Which bit? The bit about why I did do it. The research itself has happened over the last 4 or 5 years, but obviously, yeah, I'm old enough that I've been working in the sector and then in academia for all of those governments.
I was just interested to know that in probably the non-miraculous way, if we have a change of government this year, how would that, and obviously coming with that will be new arts policy. And I'm just wondering how politically contextually dependent FailSpace is, or will we see some of the same questions with a new government and a new arts and cultural policy?
I mean, I suppose I give a quick answer to that I think most of the audit culture that we see and the culture of evaluation and all that started with New Labour, actually. So I don't have confidence that Labour will suddenly wash it away. And let's be honest. I mean, I have a quote from Sadiq Khan, which who once said to one of his members of staff, "I don't care about the quality of work, I just want the headlines." So yes, I think I think our party political system persists, whoever is in government.
It might be worth saying, though, that the culture wars that is particular to this government certainly makes people more afraid of talking about failure. I think that's my sense. And certainly some funding bodies are more resistant to talking about failure, I think, because of that.
I think that's a very good point, that certainly makes people more scared of talking about failure. I think you could also argue that makes it more important to do so, because people will call you out as a failure, whether you call yourself out as one or not. So actually some honesty could help with that as well, I think. It would be my personal take on that.
Yeah, I've got a question from Emma in the chat. Are there ever limits to learning from failure, specifically in relation to holding leaders accountable for mistakes that could have been avoided by listening to staff and artists? And how can we be open about the costs of learning from failures? Or could that have been avoided? And she asks, is she being too cynical?
I mean, I guess that's one of the things that we're particularly interested in. I suppose where me and David, who did the research, started from was that we're more interested in the policy learning, and that I think there's too much focus on organisations having to do all the learning and policymakers just being the recipient of that, and it being devolved down to organisations to evaluate, but policymakers not evaluating themselves enough. And I think that's exactly what Kate's talking about, is in terms of her trying to get Art Fund themselves to be reflective, not just ask the organisations they fund to be reflective. So a lot of what we were asking people to do was, in our research, was position where the failure sat, and the difference between being a failure, or the project being a failure, and being failed. And very often, actually, it could be, the system, the funders, that the external factors that are failing the sector or failing. But I would say that's also about learning. So Kate's example that she gave at the end there about the trends that are emerging about the numbers for participation. All the research tells us that quality participation does not reach large numbers, and yet both funders and organisations persist in this numbers game. So actually it's that kind of learning that if we really start seeing those trends emerging by being honest about it, rather than trying to fabricate numbers, which I've seen many organisations do. So I suppose I'd say no. I think it's more and more essential in those kind of really problematic areas, but I do recognise why it's difficult to do.
I'll just pick up the other part of that point, Emma, which is about holding leaders accountable for mistakes, because I think so. I've just used FailSpace with a group of colleagues working on a project, quite high profile for them, but the senior manager was not in the room, and we got really stuck on purpose because they just didn't actually know is it A or is it B, or what the right balance between those things. And actually we really need that person to help answer that question. So if we don't, then the project might fail because they don't really know which one we're trying to achieve. There are two ways of going, and they could be very different. So I think, if the senior managers are not part of the discussion around failure, then that can be really problematic.
Can I just add to that before we then do go to the other questions? Completely agree about that. So for me, it's not about that there are limits to how much you could talk about failure. It is that question I was saying about, and then what do we do with it once we've acknowledged that failure? So one of our case studies was creative people and places, and we deliberately chose case studies of initiatives that people generally talked about as successes. And everybody we spoke to in that case study, from the Arts Council to the organisation to the participants, cited the same 3 things as failures. And yet there was no, and even though the Arts Council admitted those failures and said that those failures were inherent to the design of the programme from the beginning, there was no will to actually do anything about them. And that's the problem for me, is there's no point in talking about it unless you're going to do something about it. So exactly as Kate said, so you need the people in the room and the will to make the change.
Yeah. Kate, Richard has a question.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And thanks for the 2 papers. I found it really very, very interesting. I'm wondering if there's perhaps an ambivalence at the heart of what we're trying to do here. It seems to me that on the one hand, you're saying that failure is something which is subjective and which is non-binary. But on the other hand, it seems that you're still using the language of failure and success. And I think that that bounds the whole discussion. So I think there's a tension there. And one of the reasons I came to this talk was not least because I have, in inverted commas, failed to get grant or awards in an academic career. But in many ways, I've not viewed those as failures, and I kind of subscribe to moving the discursive frame of this in many ways, and drawing on the work of Halberstam and formerly her, but now his Art of Queer Failure. I think I've found very interesting, and just very briefly to quote from the Duke University website, the queer art of failure is about finding alternatives to conventional understandings of success in a heteronormative capitalist society, looking at different methods of knowing, looking at low theory. And I think that kind of shifts our frame. And so, I mean, is there something perhaps more subversive we can do here? Can we reject the very framework of failure and success, which is what I think some of the grid and the chart and some of what you've said this afternoon invites us to do?
So, I mean, I'll start with that, and Kate, I don't know if you want to come in on that as well. I mean, we've had that conversation a number of times with people, and some people just saying, actually, if it's such an uncomfortable word, why use it in the first place? Why do we find words that can help us think differently or can get rid of some of that discomfort? I suppose we would argue it's the discomfort with the word that is its power, and it's the discomfort with the word that actually encourages people to think differently. And so we've very deliberately and consciously kept those words because they are the people do feel judged, and people do feel that they are being asked to think about, and as Kate said, people do feel they have failed even if they haven't. So for us, it is to challenge what we mean by success and failure. It is to make us recognize that success and failure means different things. So one of the questions I would have had for Kate when she was talking about doing it as a group, one of the things we're nervous about is trying to get people to agree what success and failure is, because of course it means if it means different things for different people, then different people in the room might have their own take on it. But it is about the discomfort, I would say, that the more interesting thinking comes from.
I'd add to that I've had groups where people do seem particularly uncomfortable. I think it does happen that if one person reacts very badly, it does spread to the group. And we've just said, well, what language do we want to use? This is just about a spectrum. This is about thinking, what could one end of what could one pole look like? What could the other pole look like? And if people want to change the language, then that's for them to do, really. I don't think you need to get stuck on it. But I think the idea of trying to calibrate is really useful. So actually, even the facets we've said to people, so for example, the word practice is, in the cultural sector, practice, I think most people understand what that means, but in other fields, practice doesn't really read. So if you want to change that language, change it, I'd say. There's no kind of, there's no reason not to, really.
Okay. Time for one more question, I think. This was from Huey in the chat. To what extent does this new conversation about failure invite or require a new conversation about the intent, culture, and cultural policy? With failure being directly related to intent.
Well, I guess that relates to that, for me, to that last point about the intent is different for different funders, and is different between funders and organisations, and is different between organisations and the public who may or may not participate in. So I guess it would be intent for who, and I guess that's what underpins all of our research. I mean, Kate was talking then about you can change the facets, you can change the language. Apart from my obsession with using the word failure, the tools are a way of having the conversation. They're not the thing itself. And so I don't care if nobody uses the grid or the framework and creates their own at all. It's not about us kind of selling our method. It's about trying to encourage that language of failure. But what is crucial for me is that you recognise it's not the same for everyone, and the intent simply isn't the same for everyone. So it is kind of success and failure for whom, to what extent, to what purpose is the kind of underlying principle.
Probably got time for one very quick question, if people want to ask that, but we do like to finish a couple of minutes before the hour so that people can then get to the next engagement, have a little break. So you've got about, if you want another question, you've got about 15 seconds before I share my screen again to just promote our next Insight series before we go.
As I said, if anyone does have questions afterwards or would like to explore any of this further, they could contact me or Kate, or indeed contact Dave and persuade him to run a workshop.
Yeah, well, maybe I think that we are going to have plans for doing that. So hopefully, see on my screen our next Insight series on Pracademia, and I've lost it on my screen here, but I believe it's May the 14th, 11 o'clock, and the sign up link is on the screen there, which you should be able to click. I can put it in the chat as well. But I'd just like to end by saying thank you very much to Leila and Kate. Amazing presentation, really interesting, lots of things to think about, and I'm just a bit jealous that I've never been able to use the framework before. So really interesting.
Use it on your next dinner, Dave. That's I've got people who just use it to rate their dinners.
I've got turkey burgers tonight, so we'll see how that goes. I think they might be, well, I'm not sure about that. I think maybe a resilient success. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you again, Leila and Kate. Thank you, everybody, for coming along today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for the questions.
Yeah. All right, we'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.